My name is Scarlett Kelly. I am 35 years old. 11 years ago, my brother-in-law, Kevin Reed, stood up during a family meeting at our father's construction supply warehouse and presented forged emails and fake client complaints that made it look like I had been leaking trade secrets to competitors while I worked there as the office manager. He claimed I was the reason the business was losing contracts and insisted my father cut me off completely from any family support or inheritance discussions. It cost me my job, my savings of $57,000 in emergency funds I had built, and left me packing a single suitcase and walking out the front door with nowhere to go in the middle of a late-night family crisis call. Now here I am in the emergency room waiting area of Salt Lake City Regional Hospital while my father fights for his life after a severe stroke, and Kevin is waving another folder of so-called proof that I've been sabotaging the company all along. I feel my hands shake, but I square my shoulders because I swear right here and now that I will not let him erase me again without a fight. If you have ever been blindsided by an in-law who turned your own family against you with lies that still echo years later, drop a like and tell me in the comments what that moment felt like for you, because I read every single one, and you are not alone in this. I sat there on the hard plastic chair under the fluorescent lights, trying to keep my breathing steady while the nurse behind the desk typed away on her computer. My best friend Isabella Reed had driven me straight from my apartment the moment the call came in about my father's stroke. She squeezed my hand now and whispered that whatever happened next, we would face it together. Isabella had been my rock ever since we met at a community book club 4 years earlier. She knew the whole ugly history with my brother-in-law because I had poured it out to her over countless cups of coffee. Across the room, my older sister Grace sat with her arms crossed, staring at the floor. She had not said much since we arrived, but I could feel the tension radiating off her. My stepmother Patricia paced near the vending machine, clutching a cup of terrible hospital coffee. The only person missing was my grandmother, Shirley Foster. She was 82 years old now, and I had begged her to stay home in her small house on the outskirts of town because the last thing I wanted was for her to see this family unravel in real time. The double doors to the treatment area swung open, and my brother-in-law Kevin Reed strode out like he owned the place. He was still wearing his work boots from the warehouse, and his face wore that familiar smirk that always meant trouble. Kevin had married my older sister 9 years ago, and from day one he had made it his mission to position himself as the indispensable son my father never had. He handled the books for the family business now. He made all the big decisions, and he never missed a chance to remind everyone how unreliable I supposedly was. He stopped right in front of me, and the rest of the family gathered closer like he had called a meeting. "Well, Scarlett," he said, his voice dripping with that fake concern that always hid the knife. "The doctors say Dad's stable for now, but the stress from the last few quarters has been brutal on him. And guess what turned up in the old files this morning? More evidence of those missing vendor payments from back when you were handling the accounts. $57,000 unaccounted for. Funny how it lines up with the time you suddenly needed cash for your little side projects." My stomach dropped like a stone. I had not touched the company books in 11 years. I had been 24 years old when Kevin first pulled this stunt and convinced my father that I was the reason the business was struggling. Back then, he had shown up at a family meeting with printed emails that looked exactly like they came from my account. They claimed I was bad-mouthing the company to suppliers. My father had believed him without even asking me for my side. He had told me right there in front of everyone to pack my things and figure my own life out, because he did not need that kind of disloyalty in the family. I had walked out of the warehouse that night with nothing but my purse and the clothes on my back. No ride, no money for a hotel. I had ended up calling a distant cousin who let me crash on her couch for 3 weeks while I scrambled to find a new job. Now here Kevin was doing it again, only this time in a hospital waiting room with my father's life hanging in the balance. My stepmother Patricia stopped pacing and looked at me with wide eyes, but she did not say a word to defend me. That was her specialty, staying quiet while bad things happened. My older sister Grace shifted in her seat but kept her mouth shut too. Kevin leaned in closer, his voice low enough that the nurse could not hear, but loud enough for all of us. "You know the board is meeting next week to vote on the new operating agreement," he continued, with that sharp, sarcastic edge. "If they see this new evidence, it is going to be pretty clear that you cannot be trusted around any family assets. Not after what you pulled before. Dad always said you were the weak link. I am just making sure the truth comes out before he wakes up and has to deal with it himself." I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, but I forced my voice steady. "Kevin, those documents are fake, just like the ones you showed 11 years ago. I never touched a single vendor payment. I was the one who caught the discrepancies back then. Remember, before you turned everything around on me." He laughed, that short, forced sound that was never genuine. "Always the victim, Scarlett. Always with the excuses. Isabella here has heard all your stories, I am sure." He glanced at my best friend, who was now gripping my hand tighter. "But the rest of the family knows the real story. Grace knows. Patricia knows. Even your grandmother Shirley has seen how much chaos you bring." My colleague Tyler Foster had texted me earlier, offering to come down to the hospital if I needed backup. Tyler worked with me at the medical clinic where I'd been the office manager for the last 6 years. He had become a close friend after we bonded over late-night inventory shifts. I had not called him yet because I did not want to drag anyone else into this mess, but the way Kevin was escalating, I might need to. The doctor came out then and called us all into a small conference room to update us on my father's condition. Kevin made sure to sit right next to the doctor and start flipping through his folder of papers again, as if he were the only one qualified to speak. The doctor explained that my father had suffered a serious stroke, but they had caught it early. Recovery would take months of therapy. Decisions about the business would need to be made carefully in the meantime. Kevin jumped in before anyone else could speak. "Doctor, with all due respect, the family has some concerns about Scarlett's involvement in any long-term planning. There is a pattern here of unreliability that goes back more than a decade. I have documentation." My grandmother Shirley arrived at that exact moment. She had driven herself despite my protest. At 82, she still moved with purpose, and her eyes locked on Kevin. The second she stepped into the room, she had never trusted him, and she had told me so many times over the years. She sat down beside me and placed a protective hand on my arm. "Kevin," she said, her voice calm but firm, "this is not the time or the place for your little power plays. Let the doctor finish." Kevin's face tightened, but he kept that sarcastic smile. "Shirley, with respect, this is exactly the time. The business cannot afford another scandal. If Scarlett gets any say in the decisions while Dad is recovering, who knows what damage she could do." The room went quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning. My stepmother Patricia looked down at her hands. My older sister Grace finally spoke up, but it was only to agree with Kevin in that soft way she always did. "He is right, Mom. We have to protect the company." I felt the familiar weight settle in my chest, the same one I had carried for 11 years. My best friend Isabella leaned over and whispered that we should get a lawyer involved immediately. I nodded, but inside I was already calculating how much this new round of accusations would cost me. My reputation in the small business community in Salt Lake City had taken years to rebuild after the first time Kevin smeared me. Clients still sometimes ask me about those old rumors when they learned my last name was Kelly. Kevin stood up then and announced he was going to make some calls to the company board members. He looked straight at me as he left the room. "Do us all a favor, Scarlett, and stay out of the way. Some of us are trying to keep this family afloat." The door clicked shut behind him, and the doctor excused himself to check on my father. My grandmother Shirley turned to me with fire in her eyes. "That man has been gunning for you since the day he married your sister. We are not letting him get away with this again." But even as she said it, I could see the exhaustion in her face. At 82, she should not have to fight my battles. Isabella suggested we step outside for some air, and I agreed, because the walls of that waiting room felt like they were closing in. As we walked down the hallway, my phone buzzed with a text from my colleague, Tyler Foster. He had heard from another coworker that Kevin had already started calling people in the industry, spreading the new story about the forged documents. The public exposure was beginning, and it was moving faster than I could stop it. I stopped in the middle of the corridor and leaned against the wall. 11 years of rebuilding my life, piece by piece, and here we were again. My brother-in-law had just lit the match on my reputation once more, and this time the flames might burn everything I had worked for. I stopped in the middle of the corridor and leaned against the wall. 11 years of rebuilding my life piece by piece, and here we were again. My brother-in-law had just lit the match on my reputation once more, and this time the flames might burn everything I had worked for. My grandmother Shirley pulled me into a quick hug. Right there in the hallway, her grip surprisingly strong for someone 82 years old. She had always been the one person in the family who saw straight through my brother-in-law, and she was not about to let this slide. Isabella stood right beside her, nodding along as I explained the text from Tyler about the calls my brother-in-law was already making to people in the business community. The three of us stepped into a quieter corner near the elevators, where the air felt a little less suffocating. My grandmother looked me dead in the eye and said we needed to get ahead of this before it spread any further. Isabella pulled out her phone and started searching for a family law attorney who could meet us the next morning. I appreciated their fire, but the knot in my stomach only tightened because I knew how fast my brother-in-law could move when he smelled weakness. Before we could even finish the conversation, the double doors opened again, and my brother-in-law came striding back down the hallway with my older sister right on his heels. He had that folder tucked under his arm like it was a trophy, and his eyes locked on me immediately. He did not even acknowledge my grandmother or Isabella at first. Instead, he stopped a few feet away and let out that short, sarcastic laugh that always preceded his worst jabs. Still hiding in the hallway, "Scarlett," he said, his voice carrying just enough to make the nurse at the nearby station glance over. "The doctor wants the family to discuss power of attorney since Dad might be out for weeks. I already told him it makes sense for me to handle it given the history. We cannot have someone with your track record making decisions that affect the company. Remember the vendor mess 11 years ago? The one that cost us over $80,000 in lost contracts because you supposedly mixed up the accounts. Yeah, the board members I just called remember it too." My breath caught, but I forced myself to stay calm. Those vendor issues had never been my fault. I had been 24 and working as the office manager, trying to keep the construction supply warehouse running smoothly while my father dealt with his own health scares back then. My brother-in-law had been the one quietly shifting numbers and then pointing the finger at me with printed spreadsheets that looked official but never held up under real scrutiny. He had convinced my father I was careless at best and disloyal at worst. That night, 11 years ago, I had walked away from the warehouse with nothing but the clothes on my back and a reputation in our small Ohio town that took years to shake. Now he was dredging it all up again while my father lay in a hospital bed unable to speak for himself. My grandmother stepped forward, her voice steady but edged with steel. "Kevin, this is not the place for business politics. Your father needs rest, not more stress from your accusations." My brother-in-law turned his sarcastic smile on her next, though his eyes stayed cold. "Surely, with all due respect, this is exactly the place. The company employs 27 people. If Scarlett gets any say while Dad is down, who knows what mistakes she will make again. I am just protecting the family like I always have." He glanced at my older sister, who nodded quickly without meeting my eyes. "Grace agrees. We talked about it on the way back from the cafeteria. The pattern is clear." My stepmother Patricia had wandered over by then, still clutching her coffee cup. She shifted from one foot to the other, but said nothing to contradict him. That silence stung more than anything, because it had been the same 11 years ago, when my brother-in-law first turned the family against me. My older sister finally spoke up, her tone soft but firm in support of him. "He is right. We have to think about the business first. Dad would want that." I felt the familiar heat of betrayal creep up my neck, but before I could respond, Tyler walked through the main entrance carrying 2 takeout coffees. He had driven over the moment he heard the rumors were flying, and his presence steadied me a little. Tyler had worked with me at the medical clinic for the last 6 years, and he knew the real story behind my departure from the family business. because I had shared it during one particularly long night shift. He handed me a coffee and positioned himself beside Isabella like he belonged in the circle. My brother-in-law noticed him immediately, and his expression sharpened. Yeah. Who is this? My brother-in-law asked with that cutting sarcasm that made everything sound like an accusation. Another one of your little supporters, Scarlett. Does he know about the $80,000 you cost the family last time? Or the way you walked away and left us to clean up your mess? Tyler set his jaw, but stayed quiet, letting me handle it. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the waiting area starting to turn our way. My brother-in-law had a talent for making private family business feel like public spectacle without ever raising his voice too loud. He flipped open the folder again and pulled out another sheet of paper, waving it like evidence in a courtroom. Well, look, I even pulled the old bank statements from the storage unit this afternoon. He continued, his words laced with mock concern that hid the contempt perfectly. The discrepancies line up exactly with the months you were in charge. If Dad wakes up and sees you involved, it could set his recovery back months. Stress like that is dangerous at his age. I am only saying what everyone is thinking. My grandmother cut in, then her tone sharper than I had heard in years. Kevin, you have been saying what everyone is thinking for over a decade, and it has never been the truth. Scarlett was the one who caught the real errors in those books before you buried them. My brother-in-law did not miss a beat. He turned that sarcastic edge on her again. Shirley, I respect you, but you were not in the office every day like I was. You did not see the late nights I put in, fixing what she left behind. He looked back at me, his eyes narrowing. The board is voting on the new operating agreement in 4 days. I suggest you stay out of it entirely for Dad's sake. The words landed like a slap, and the hallway seemed to shrink around us. Isabella squeezed my arm and whispered that we should call the lawyer tonight, not tomorrow. Tyler nodded in agreement, saying he could vouch for my character to anyone who asked, because he had seen me handle the clinic books flawlessly for years. My older sister shifted uncomfortably, but still sided with my brother-in-law, in that quiet way she always did when push came to shove. My stepmother, Patricia, finally muttered something about needing more coffee and slipped away again, avoiding the whole mess. We moved back into the small conference room when the doctor returned for another update. My father was stable, but still unconscious, and the next 48 hours would be critical. My brother-in-law immediately took the lead again, suggesting he be granted temporary power of attorney for both medical and business decisions. He slid the folder across the table toward the doctor as if it proved his point beyond doubt. Doctor, I have documentation showing a clear pattern, he said, his voice smooth and reasonable on the surface, but I heard the venom underneath. Scarlett cannot be trusted with anything that affects the family right now. It is for everyone's protection. My grandmother objected immediately, and Isabella started listing reasons why an independent review was needed. Tyler stood silently beside me, offering quiet support with his presence. But as the doctor listened and took notes, I could see the doubt creeping into his expression. My brother-in-law had planted the seed perfectly, and it was already taking root. The meeting ended with the doctor saying he would consult the hospital ethics team, but that family consensus mattered. As we filed out of the room, my brother-in-law fell into step beside me for a moment, his voice low enough for only me to hear. 4 days, Scarlett. Stay out of the way, or I will make sure the whole town knows exactly who you are. Again. My phone buzzed in my pocket before I could even process the threat. It was a message from a former supplier I had not spoken to in years. The text asked if the rumors about me and the old company were true, because someone had just called him, warning him to be careful. The public exposure was accelerating faster than I could have imagined, and my brother-in-law had only been back in the hospital for a couple of hours. I stared at the screen, feeling the ground shift under my feet. 11 years of distance and careful rebuilding, and one hospital visit had brought it all crashing back. My grandmother and Isabella were already talking about next steps, but I knew my brother-in-law would not stop until he had me completely cut out again. The question was whether I would let him, or whether this time the cost would be more than I could bear. The text from the former supplier made my stomach turn. I showed it to Isabella and my grandmother right there in the hallway. But before we could even plan our next move, my brother-in-law rounded the corner with my older sister and my stepmother trailing behind him. He spotted the phone in my hand, and that sarcastic smirk I knew too well spread across his face like he had been waiting for this exact moment. "Already getting the warnings, Scarlett." My brother-in-law said, his voice loud enough that a couple of nurses glanced our way. "Good. Word travels fast in this town. The board members I spoke to earlier are not happy about the possibility of you being involved while Dad is down. They remember the old stories too well. The ones about how you nearly cost the company $80,000 in lost contracts because of your sloppy work." He stopped right in front of me, folder still tucked under his arm, and leaned in just enough to make the words feel like a knife. "Let me be crystal clear. This is not personal. It is about protecting what Dad built over 30 years. You walking away 11 years ago was the best thing for everyone. Now stay away from the power of attorney discussion and the operating agreement vote in 4 days, or I will make sure every supplier and client knows exactly why the company struggled when you were in charge again." My grandmother stepped between us, her voice steady but edged with warning. "Kevin, you have no right to threaten her like this in a hospital." My brother-in-law let out that short, cutting laugh that always signaled he was about to twist the knife deeper. "Surely, with all due respect, this is not a threat. It is reality. Grace can back me up." She saw the discrepancies back then with her own eyes. My older sister nodded quickly without meeting my gaze. "He is only trying to keep things stable for Dad." The words hung heavy, but the real blow came moments later, when my stepmother, who had been silent through most of this, finally cracked under the pressure of my grandmother's direct questions. She admitted in a shaky voice that my older sister had actually helped my brother-in-law compile some of the fake documents 11 years ago. She had quietly printed extra spreadsheets and helped him alter a few emails because she wanted him to look like the strong, reliable one in my father's eyes. The hidden truth landed like a second betrayal I never saw coming. My older sister had not just stayed quiet. She had actively fed the lies that got me thrown out of the family business. I felt the hallway tilt, but my brother-in-law did not miss a beat. He jumped right back in with the sharp, sarcastic edge. "See, Scarlett, even your own sister knew the truth back then. You were always the weak link, the one who could not handle the pressure. Dad is fighting for his life right now, and the last thing he needs is more stress from your drama. Sign the temporary waiver tomorrow, or I will call an emergency board meeting and make this public. Your choice." Isabella pulled me aside immediately, and Tyler, who had been waiting nearby, stepped forward, offering to contact a lawyer friend of his who specialized in family business disputes. We met with the attorney the very next morning at a small office downtown. The lawyer reviewed everything we had, including the old bank statements my brother-in-law kept waving around, and confirmed what I already suspected. The documents were doctored in ways that would not hold up in a real audit, but fighting it would take months and thousands of dollars in legal fees. More importantly, it would drag my father's recovery into the mud with endless stress and public arguments. The board vote was scheduled for the following afternoon. My brother-in-law made sure I received a formal email invitation, but the tone made it clear I was not welcome. He had already lined up support from the other members by feeding them updated versions of the old accusations. Tyler offered to come with me as moral support, and Isabella insisted on driving. My grandmother met us at the warehouse conference room looking exhausted but determined. When we walked in, my brother-in-law was already at the head of the table with my older sister beside him, and my stepmother in the corner looking anywhere but at me. The meeting opened, with my brother-in-law taking the floor first, as always. Before we vote on the new operating agreement and the power of attorney, I want to address the elephant in the room. Scarlett has been asked multiple times to step back for the good of the company, but here she is again. We cannot risk another round of mistakes that cost us $80,000 last time. He slid copies of the folder across the table, his eyes locking on mine with pure contempt. This is not about family grudges. This is about survival. 27 employees depend on us. Dad built this from nothing, and I will not let it crumble because of one person's unreliability. The room went silent for a beat. I tried to speak up and present the lawyer's findings, but my brother-in-law cut me off immediately with another sarcastic jab. "Save it, Scarlett. We have heard your excuses for 11 years. Grace saw the original errors herself. Patricia knows the history. The board has already reviewed the evidence I provided. The vote is simple: temporary full authority to me until Dad recovers, or we make other arrangements. My grandmother objected fiercely, pointing out the inconsistencies in the documents and the fact that I had built a solid career at the medical clinic with flawless records for 6 years. Isabella and Tyler both spoke up, offering character references and suggesting an independent audit. But the board members my brother-in-law had already called the day before shifted uncomfortably and ultimately sided with him. The vote passed quickly. He received temporary power of attorney for both medical and business decisions. The operating agreement changes went through, giving him majority control moving forward. The defeat settled over me like a weight I could not shake. I had come prepared with facts and support, yet my brother-in-law's years of positioning himself as the savior had won out again. In the parking lot afterward, my older sister approached me alone for the first time. She looked torn, but the words that came out only confirmed the earlier admission from my stepmother. I did help him back then, Scarlett. I thought it would make things easier for everyone if Kevin looked strong. Dad was already struggling, and I did not want you causing more problems. It was not an apology. It was just another layer of the same old pattern. My brother-in-law had orchestrated everything, but my older sister had willingly played her part because she resented me for reasons I would never fully understand. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the waiver document the lawyer had prepared as a last resort. Signing it would mean permanently stepping away from any future involvement in the family business or decisions about my father's care. It would mean accepting that my brother-in-law had won control, and that the family ties I had tried to rebuild in the hospital were severed once more. Refusing to sign would mean months of legal battles, public accusations, and more stress on my father that the doctor said could be dangerous in his condition. The choice was painful, but I signed it the next morning at the hospital. My brother-in-law was there when I handed the papers to the nurse handling the forms. He did not gloat out loud this time, but the satisfied look in his eyes said everything. "Smart decision, Scarlett," he said quietly as he walked past me toward my father's room. "Some people just are not cut out for this family. Stay out of the way and everyone wins." My grandmother hugged me tightly afterward, tears in her eyes, but even she knew there was no fighting it anymore. Isabella and Tyler stayed with me for hours that evening, trying to remind me that my career at the clinic was still mine, and that I had built a life worth protecting. Yet as I left the hospital that final time, I felt the isolation settle in deep. My father would recover under my brother-in-law's watch. The business would run without me. My older sister and stepmother would continue pretending everything was normal. I had chosen self-preservation over one more impossible fight. But the cost was the last fragile thread connecting me to the family I once believed in. Weeks later, I visited my father alone when I knew my brother-in-law would be at the warehouse. He was awake, but weak, and the conversation stayed surface level. He thanked me for signing the papers and said it had eased his mind knowing the company was in steady hands. I did not argue. I simply told him I loved him and left with a quiet ache that has not faded. My brother-in-law remains in control, untouched by any real consequences. I have my job, my friends, and my own small apartment, but the family I fought so hard to hold on to is gone for good this time. Choosing myself meant losing them, and some days the regret still whispers that maybe I should have fought harder. But deep down, I know another round would have destroyed what little peace I had left. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever had to make that painful choice to walk away from family after a brother-in-law turned everyone against you just to protect your own future, tell me in the comments whether the loneliness ever gets easier, because I still wonder every single day.